So all the studies show that the Christian faith is the most persecuted faith on the earth today.
When they first built Westminster Abbey, on this western facade, they had niches for statues, but they didn't ever add any statues. Last century, they renovated all of the Abbey, and on this western facade decided to add statues. At the top, there are those of the conventional saints, 6 of them. Either side of the door, there are allegorical statues of truth, justice, mercy, and peace. But across the top of the door, there are 10 figures. They are of people who have lost their lives in the 20th century for the cause of the kingdom of God. It's a reminder that wherever the gospel has been taken, people have paid for it with their lives. It's an interesting gathering of statues. There are those who are famous and anonymous. There are men and women. There are people from every part of the world. In the 20th century, potentially more people lost their lives than any time before that for the message of Jesus. It tells us that when people have taken the message of Jesus to the ends of the earth, people have paid for it with their lives. So Lynn, what form did the persecution take?
Well, it depended on the circumstances. Sometimes it was very violent. They lost their lives. But sometimes it was that they would not go to the shops, they wouldn't buy their goods, or the family would ostracize them. Well, in that time, you really relied on your neighbors and your family. So to be ostracized was a really big deal. So the persecution varied, but for those who claimed Christ as Messiah, as their Lord, there was usually a cost.
Why would people persecute them? Why would the Roman Empire be interested?
Yeah, there's a number of reasons why. Christians were just capital O other. They looked weird, they looked strange, and maybe even a little bit subversive. And the Romans may not have always fully understood why they persecuted them. I mean, if you read the correspondence between Governor Pliny of Bithynia, who's got people being accused of Christians, and you get some people say, look, I used to be a Christian, but I gave it up. And then you get others say, you damn right I'm a Christian, and I'm proud of it. And he's kind of like, well, what do I do with these people? And he writes to the emperor, and Pliny's describing them, so as far as I can tell, all these people do is kind of meet, pray, worship, and promise not to do anything illegal, but they refuse to worship our gods. And if they're guilty, basically on the spot you can kill them. Merely being found to be a professing Christian was a capital offense.
In the early 2nd century, Pliny, in his letter to the Emperor Trajan, book 10, letter 96, Pliny says to the emperor, look, I've found these Christians. I haven't found them doing anything wrong per se, but they're accused to me, so I follow up and I say, okay, well, I'll let you go if you just offer some incense to the image of the emperor. Seems like a small thing to him, just to show you're really loyal to Rome. They refuse to do it, and so I execute them.
Why was offering a pinch of incense a problem for a Christian?
Because Christians, like Jews, recognized there was only one true God, and only one God is worthy of our worship.
It is about crises of ultimate allegiance. So that, for example, the current government of India, which is a right-wing Hindu government, is making it increasingly difficult for Christians because they are wanting to say your ultimate allegiance must be to a state that they want to define as Hindu, although strictly speaking, India is a secular state. And one of the ironies that Christians in the West don't always realize is that in many ways a secular state is a very good thing. If you are in a situation of being a religious minority, in India, for example, or in a state of parity in Nigeria, where you have Christianity and Islam are roughly the same size, it's a very good thing if your state says, we are a secular state, because it can then hold the ring impartially between these different religious groups.
Part of what our call is, and part of what that call that leads to a persecution is we have a faith that is by its very nature a missionary faith. Whereas you can go, there are faiths around the world that are not. And so basically, for example, in a lot of countries, it is fine. Let's look at Muslim majority countries. In most of those places, it's fine to be a Christian, right? You have a second-class status, there's certain things you have to do. But the challenge is the Christian is a follower of the Christ, and the Christ said, go make disciples of all nations. So upon sharing the gospel in a Muslim majority nation where apostasy is illegal and worthy of death, you have then entered into a crime that the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings told you to do, but the governing authorities said that you can't. And from its earliest times, the Christian said, we must obey God rather than men. And in obeying God rather than men, they have actually committed a crime in most Muslim majority nations. That is sharing the gospel.
We became sure that we need to evangelize Iranian people by distributing Bibles, because in Iran you can't find Bibles. At that time we didn't have any Bible, and we just called our pastor who was in London, and we asked them to send thousands of New Testaments to Iran.
We had a plan. We bought a map. It was a big map. We put it on the wall, and we decided to distribute Bibles from the north of Tehran to the south of Tehran. And we had 2 backpacks. Every night we would pack our backpacks with about 140 New Testaments. They were small New Testaments. And we would just walk. We would decide which area we would go, and then with our backpacks we would start walking in those areas and put those New Testaments in people's mailboxes.
And how many did you give out?
A total 20,000.
But beside that, we had 2 house churches. One of them was among prostitutes and the other one among young people.
Eventually though, Marzian, you were arrested.
I was born a Muslim. I therefore know a bit about Islam. Where they are in the minority, they play it very, very, they play their game very well. They kind of compromise. They kind of, flow with the stream. And, they don't attack people and things like that. Where they are like 50-50, they fight a lot. Where they are 60-70, then of course they want to be in control. And Sharia is introduced. So the problem of Nigeria is this 50-50, where they now therefore are continually fighting each other.
So I've been posted now to Trinity Chapel. It's close to the University of Jos. Now that church was burnt in 2008, crisis. Then by 2010, when there was an attempt to rebuild the church, it was destroyed again. So just after my year in OCA, that's in Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, I had this wonderful team of staff and students I worked with. So we're able to raise some donations, and they gave me this beautiful, beautiful tent. So coming back to Nigeria, we erected this tent. We call it the tent of meeting. And then we had this beautiful worship when we erected in the midst of the burnt building was where we erected this tent. But unfortunately, in 1st October last year, there was yet another attempt to destroy the church. So again, this group of youths came, destroyed the furnishing, took away the PA system, the public address system, destroyed all the music equipment, and tried burning the church. But because it was fireproof, it is still standing. So it's beautiful that we are still worshiping in that burnt building.
When they arrested us, first they transferred us to a police station. I remember the first day we had long hours of interrogation. By our first interrogator, he threatened us to physical torture. He sent us to a very dark and dirty cell in a basement and told us that you should give us all the information about your friends, your activities as Christians, your network, the people who you work with, and especially the name of those people who come to your house churches. And he threatened us. He told us that we will beat you until you vomit blood. You have to give us all this information. In that detention, they kept us there for 14 days before transferring us to Evin prison.
Evin prison is notorious for arresting, raping, torturing, and executing of many innocent people. And I remember the first day that we entered Evin prison, we were surprised because we could see there are, intellectuals and respectful people there, such as students, lawyers, journalists, and all these people were in that prison because their opinion was against the government. They transferred us in Evin prison with the charges of apostasy, blasphemy, and promoting Christianity. For a couple of months, we were in the public ward with other prisoners, but after that, they transferred us to another building inside Evin prison, which is very famous. It's called 209. It's a security building. They usually transfer political prisoners in that building for interrogation, torturing. And they transferred us in that building for 40 days. And once a week, we had a very heavy interrogation by 2 interrogators. Most of the time, as Mariam mentioned, they tried to put pressure on us to deny our faith in Jesus. They told us if you want to insist on your faith, you would face execution by hanging.
I grew up in a comfortable culture and a beautiful country, and I think when I meet with, over my time with the Persecuted Church, they talk to me, the simplicity of the gospel is being able to articulate who Jesus is and what he's done in your life. But when I look at my own life, I feel that the relative safety of culture and the stability of the economic climate that I've grown up in, when I look back, it makes it more and more difficult to see where the hand of Jesus has been, the highs and the lows, whereas in the Persecuted Church, they can speak to you for days, for hours, about what Jesus is to them, what he's done in their life, the transformation he brings, why he matters to you.
Every day we had to deal with fear. Every day we had to wait for them to come take us for physical torture, for mental torture, because in prison we were with many political prisoners, and every day they would share with us what the guards did to them. Our best friend, who later was executed, Shirin Alamhouli, she was a Kurdish woman. She was fighting for women's rights. She was only 28 years old, and when we went to that prison, she shared with us how the guards tortured her for months.
Open Doors, did they start the World Watch List?
We did, yeah. So in 1993, we released the first World Watch List. It's an indexed ranking of the 50 most difficult countries to follow Jesus.
How does a country end up on the top of that list?
Persecution is, particularly in Western context, we often marginalise it only to acts of violent persecution. And more than that, I guess in a more micro sense, only acts of Muslims towards Christians. But it's far broader than that. In fact, we would say that there's a scale. At one end of that scale is acts of violent persecution, at the other end of that is non-violent persecution. And so to end up on that list, there are what we would say multiple drivers of persecution. There can be tribal antagonism, communism, dictatorial paranoia, violence. And what we do is we have a whole department that will go through, analyse each of these countries on these drivers, give them an indexed ranking and a score based out of 100, and that's how you sort of start to individualise the countries.
How's that shifting and changing over that period of time since the early 90s?
Yeah, the best way to describe a persecution is like a lung, okay? So it expands and it contracts, and based on each country, you might go through periods of intense persecution, but then periods where it frees up. China's a great example of this. It's gone through a period of intense persecution, then the gospel exploded, and now in today's world, we start seeing it contract again. Persecution's intensifying.
In 20 years' time, it's conceivable, would it be the Christian faith would be the majority faith in China? Now, of course, what's happening now, Xi Jinping and the centralized government and the persecution and things like the social credit system, things are as bad for the Christians as they were back under Mao Zedong. So it's a very tough situation.
And in that, do you see the church still flourishing or struggling?
Well, it's still flourishing with tremendous courage.
I've just got back from Central Asia, a part of the world that I love, and it marries the relentless pressure of communism with the rise of radical Islam. It's a country where to preach the gospel to anyone under the age of 16 is illegal, and more than that, it's met with a charge of religious extremism, same as terrorism, resulting in 3-year prison sentence. An incredibly difficult thing. I mean, if you think as far as suppressing the gospel goes, can you think of a better way other than stopping people teaching it to kids? Because parents, in the face of fear, will often stop taking their kids to church. And so they stop going to church, the kids stop going to church, the church disbands.
You go to a court case and your lawyer has an argument that would get you off this charge. What does the lawyer say and why did you disagree?
I was talking to a judge and he asked us if you want to insist on your faith. And I mentioned to him, if you wanted to deny our faith, we would deny it 8 months earlier, not to wait until this time. And suddenly our lawyer jumped in and told the judge, no, they have the same faith as in Islam. And I told him, no, excuse me, I need to interrupt my lawyer. We don't have the same faith because we believe Jesus is the Son of God. It's different from your faith. And that's why my lawyer became very angry at that time.
I remember we were in prison for 8 months and suddenly some high officials from the government came to prison to visit us. And we were so surprised. They asked us to go to 209 building, and there was this high official from the government that we used to see him in TV. And he came to prison with very nice food and tea and cookies. And he mentioned to us, he asked us a question. He said, have you ever been in Rome? We said, no, we have never been in Rome. And he said, so why Pope send a letter on your behalf to our government? You know, we had no idea what was going on outside, but later we realized that the Pope sent a letter to government and asked for our release. That high official who came to prison, he told us that we just put you in prison to protect you for 9 months because we know that there are prejudiced Muslims outside and they want to hurt you. That's why we wanted to protect you. From their behaviors, we could see that, you know, the influence of all those pressures on them, and they didn't want to admit that they were angry, and they just told us that you can be free, but they threatened us before letting us to be free. Our interrogators, our judges, and some high officials from the government, they threatened us that you cannot live as Christians anymore in this country.
So you're out of jail, but you felt like you were still in prison. But Marzieh, what was it like walking out of jail?
I can say it was mixed feeling because on one hand, we were so happy that finally we get the victory. God gave us the victory and we could be free. But on the other hand, we were not happy because we had many friends inside prison and we had to leave them behind. And Mariam mentioned one of our best friends, Shirin Alamuli. She was a Kurdish, and after we got released, a few months after we got released, she got executed. That experience was very painful for both of us. And that's why, you know, I'm sorry.
Take your time.
Yeah, it's very difficult to leave your friends behind and just enjoy your freedom. That's why we both believe that after we got released, we are not the same people. We can enjoy just our freedom and forget about those who are still in prison.
Here you are essentially holding worship meetings in the ashes of the building.
Exactly.
How do people remain encouraged in that setting?
Understanding the love of Jesus Christ and the gospel which we carry, because everybody coming to church, we understand one clear thing, that Jesus indeed is Lord, and He's already victorious over every circumstance and situation that we find ourselves in.
Your role is also encouraging other pastors, and the pastors in the north part of Nigeria. What are the challenges that they face as pastors up there?
Yes, the Boko Haram insurgency, plus or minus, has destroyed more than 3,000 churches in northeastern Nigeria, and number of pastors killed go into the dozens of them, more than 100, I would say, in the last 10 years. One way or the other, either they are church leaders or they are pastors, and the pastors have been targeted. So it's become very difficult. And so from 2014, when I've been going to Maiduguri from Jos to the displaced people's camps, the refugee camps in Maiduguri, I see the despair, in churches and pastors who are in the same refugee camps with their members of their congregation. And they're finding it very difficult to explain, the God that we serve, God of love, God of justice, in the midst of all the suffering.
So what do you say to a pastor who's struggling with where God is when his church is burnt down and he's living in a refugee camp?
With the pastors, trying to tell them and teach them that they are God's representatives, they are the shepherds of the sheep, and therefore they must be able to teach and let people see the love of God in all that is happening. Not that God is absent, no, He is there, taking us through.
For 9 months, we had great opportunities to share the message with many prisoners who really needed to hear the message. And also, as Marzia mentioned, it was an amazing and hard experience for both of us. We learned a lot. It was like going to a university and learn a lot of things about yourself, about your weaknesses, and also about how much you need God's power in your life.
One of these church leaders was talking to you, and he was praying for you, and you were praying for him. What was he praying for?
I remember he was a 70 or 80-year-old Chinese believer from the underground church, and as our time together drew to an end, I simply said to him, "Brother, can I pray for you?" And he says, "Yeah, I want you to pray persecution never leaves China." I remember I paused and I said, can you explain that? He says, "Well, we look at the Australian church as a prophetic example of what happens when faith becomes free." He says, "The value of Jesus drops. I want you to pray persecution never leaves China."
So what do you put that growth under persecution down to?
Truly to the Holy Spirit, but also the incredible courage of people under persecution. Well, I was born in North China during World War II. Now, I remember as a small boy when I was 6 or 7, the sermons started to get interminably long. And I said to my dad, "What's happening? This is really boring." He said, "Well, listen, they know persecution's coming. So they're laying down all the teaching and the depth and the fellowship that they can possibly have, so they're ready when it comes."
A lot of people watching this conversation will do so in the safety of the West. As a pastor in Nigeria, what would you say to people watching this in the West?
I would say, looking at it from the Nigerian perspective, I would say I think we clearly know, at least now, who our enemies are. And so we are able to confront our challenges every day, and we see God at work. I think our concern for the West is we see a different level of persecution coming. And we begin to wonder if the West can stand the kind of persecution that is coming, either through secularism or government political correctness or whatever is happening in the West. And so our worry all the time, and I think I would say our plea all the time is for the church in the West is never to give up this faith that we are dying for in Africa.